in co-productie. Petrus de Vries mocht ik al een aantal keren eerder bewonderen om zijn heldere en zeer relevante verhalen, onder andere bij eerdere STSN-symposia. Hij verstaat als Kaapstadter het Nederlands uitstekend, beter dan hij mijn Engels zou verstaan. Hij zal zijn verhaal in het Engels houden en ik daarom deze introductie in het Nederlands. Het wordt een duo-presentatie met Dr. Tosca Heunis, vanuit Zuid-Afrika in de Lage Landen neergestreken. En ook zij verstaat het Nederlands. Grappig dat haar voornaam ook staat voor de grote internationale database voor TSC. Dus wat willen we nog meer? Zij zullen ons informeren over het tandemproject en de app die daaruit naar voren komt. Graag aan jullie het woord.
Thank you. And I'm going to time myself because don't want to talk too long because I want to make sure Tosca has enough time. So if we can start my presentation. Do I need to click? Okay, there we go. So is Leonora here? She's running around. Yeah. So Leonora and I have had conversations for almost 2 years about this meeting and about can it happen. And so I am, as we've heard, so happy that we can be here together in a room. And many of you might know this is not my first lustrum either, as you've just heard. So the first lustrum I joined was in 2006. Were any of you at that lustrum? Show me? Yeah, quite a few. And that I talked about, the theme of my presentation was about the neuropsychiatry of TSC. And that was the first time, interestingly, that we started to talk about different levels of TSC-associated difficulties. We didn't have the name TAND yet, but it was interesting looking back at my pictures. That's where it kind of started for us to talk about. And then, and that, of course, was your 25th anniversary at the time. And then I came back in 2011. So I joined you for the 30th anniversary, which was in Utrecht, and my presentation then was going back to 2006 to where we were then. And the gap between 2006 and 11 was very interesting because that's when a lot of the molecular biology and all the mTOR stories and the mouse and can we use mTOR for people with TSC, there was a lot of excitement in that time. And that's the kind of things we talked about in 2011. I then also joined an STSN meeting. We were in Hotel Rotterdam. Were any of you there? Yes? Almost. Well, this is like the roadies, right? Who was in Utrecht in 2011? Also many. Very good. Who was at all three of the meetings? Very good. And we had a great meeting with Marie-Claire and Dutch and some Belgian experts talking more about neuropsychiatric problems in TSC. And then, of course, here we are today for the 40th party of STSN. So if nothing else, you will get the message that I like to come to STSN parties. So it's very nice to celebrate with you again, because it's amazing to think that you have an organization that's 40 years old. And as I always say to Jan Paul and others, the Netherlands is small, but STSN is a very powerful organization in the world for your size. So you really do incredible work in the Netherlands and in STSN in comparison to many other organizations in the world. So congratulations to you all. And we're looking forward to the next 40 years. So Leonora wanted me to talk today about the Tandem project and the TAND app. And I think the reason she wanted us to do that is quite a lot of things have changed, even since 2011, in thinking about neuropsychiatry of TSC. And one of the frustrations that all of us, you as families, all of us as professionals and researchers have had, is finding ways not just to talk about TAND and the TAND difficulties, but finding ways to do something about it, because that's what you want and that's what we want. And so this is a project that's very different from, you've heard the summary from Marie-Claire at the American meeting, where there was lots of very interesting theoretical and basic research. This is a very practical project, and I hope that you will enjoy listening to that. But I'm doing a show with a team, so I'm going to embarrass them and make them stand up. So these people on the screen are all part of the Tandem team, and they are the action group. And I'll tell you in a minute what the action group is. So Stephanie van Klooster, please stand up, is a postdoc. She lives in Belgium. She will do a presentation on the scoping review. So she will be next. Then you've already heard Anne. I don't need her to stand up again. You've seen her. Lisbeth de Waale. Lisbeth is a pediatric neurologist from Leuven. And she leads dissemination, all the information sharing in the project. Thank you, Lisbeth. And then Tosca Hunes, who's smiling or laughing there. Tosca, stand up. There we go. There's Tosca. And Tosca is the project coordinator. She's also an engineer and has done app development in the past. So she's running the kind of technical part of the project. Well, all the project. She tells us what to do, but she also runs the app development piece. So I'm going to do a little, maybe like 15 minutes of talking, and then Tosca will take over and show you the app as it looks at the moment. You've already seen these words. Anne showed you the slide about TAND levels, TAND clusters, and then Tandem. So I'm just going to go back a little bit to some of those before telling you about Tandem. Interestingly, having listened just to the morning and the presentations before, I guess if we have to come up with a summary of this year's Lustrum, maybe the key word is clusters, because our project is based on clusters, and listening to the LAM clustering work and the epilepsy clustering work, it's interesting that maybe in the TSC community people are looking for ways to subgroup or understand people with TSC in different ways. So, everybody now knows the word TAND. We made it up in 2012. And what I'm going to do is just to tell you why we made up this word. And it was for two main reasons. The first main reason is we know, and you know, that most people with TSC will have difficulties with behavior, with learning, with development, with mental health, with all these sorts of things. But we also knew that even though we had some guidelines, almost nobody actually ever had assessment or intervention for it. So there was this big gap between I need something and I get something. And that was a big problem for us. The second reason was, in the TSC community, it's still a little bit the case, there was confusion about the language, the terminologies that people use when they talk about these things. And I will show you some of the examples. These are the words. Even today we heard some of them, and when we go around the world and we talk to different people, people use these terms like cognition and behavior and neurobehavior and psychiatric. And they are all relevant and important words, but they mean different things to different people. Or sometimes the same word means different things, or different words mean the same thing. And that was confusing to families, and it was confusing also to research. So that if you say, I do research on cognition or behavior, and you do research, it might be something different. And so that's the reason we came up with Anne's umbrella. And I'm not going to go through the umbrella because you've seen it, but what we did therefore was to say all these things are important when we think about behavior, learning, development. So we call it TAND, so it now has a name. So you can talk about SEGA and AML and LAM and TAND. So we wanted to give it one name to begin with. And then the little parts of the umbrella were how we made sure that we come up with a language that's the same for everybody. So when you talk about behavioral problems, we all know that we're talking about this, the things we see. A behavior is not a disorder. A behavior is a problem that we have to think, what does it mean? And then we have to come up with a plan. A psychiatric level, as Anna said, is a diagnosis that should be made by a specialist using criteria for disorders, and not all specialists can make these diagnoses, so that's a particular thing. intellectual level, IQ type tests. These are the sorts of things. It's a very important level, but it's different from the other ones. That's why it has its own separate line. Academics, yes, if you have intellectual problems, you will have academic problems, but many people with TSC who have completely normal intellectual abilities can also have specific academic difficulties. And then that's a problem, because then often in the school system might say, but your child has normal or very high IQ, they shouldn't be struggling with their schoolwork. But actually that's not the case. So it needed a separate line and a separate box. And similarly, the neuropsychological, what do you call it, Anne? Hersenfunktie. The brain skills is my word for it. In TSC, particularly in people who have completely normal intellectual ability. In fact, I've worked with people with very high intellectual abilities who have very specific problems in their brain skills. And those very specific problems can make their lives very difficult. So for instance, I worked with a young man who had an IQ of 137. That's very high. I would be happy with an IQ of 137. But he had specific difficulties in his executive brain skills, and particularly in what we call cognitive flexibility, switching from one thing to the next. So if his brain had a plan, and he wanted to do it and it didn't work, it was very hard for him to switch. And whenever he had to switch, it either made him very anxious, or it made him very aggressive, one or the other. And it was so bad that he, even though he was a super bright young man, he couldn't go to school. For 3 years, he was out of school because of that specific problem. And when we could understand that specific problem, we were able to implement a plan for him. So you can see why that's a really important separate level. And then we talk about it all the time, the psychosocial difficulties. And often professionals are scared to ask mums and dads, how are you doing? How are the other kids doing? We've listened to Dave's story. We can't forget about the system around the person with TSC, because it's the system that needs to support. And Anne showed that very last recommendation from the consortium of caring for the caregiver, just how important that is. So a summary of the levels, but also why they were important to give them different names. And here's the checklist. It is available in Dutch. Have any of you seen it or used it? Yeah, some? Few? Oh, okay, not many. We have a job. And when we developed this, we then went to, this is just a nice picture of some people in TSCI, TSC International. You might see some of your friends or family, or maybe you're on the picture as well. TSCI is an international group of people, and Eva, I think you're one of the bosses of it at the moment, am I right? Of family organizations around the world. And we like to work very closely with TSCI because that's a way for us to make sure we do the things that families want and that families need. And so we went to the TSCI group and said, we've done the checklist, we've done TAND, what do you want us? What's the next challenge? What's the problem? And this is what people said to us. They said, it's so overwhelming. My child is so different from your child, from her child. And so when we then go to the doctors and the clinicians, they don't know what to do. They say, I don't know. And so it's like a paralysis. I don't know. And that was a problem for us. And so the question, therefore, we wanted to ask, and here's a nice picture of Lauren Leclésio. In fact, it was taken in Leiden at a meeting we had in 2016. And so Lauren then said, but maybe all these complex TAND manifestations, maybe they do come together in natural groups. And maybe if we can find not a unique pattern for all 2 million people with TSC in the world, but maybe there are groups, the clusters of things that come together. Maybe that will make it easier for families. Maybe it will make it easier for doctors. And maybe it might even make it easier for science, perhaps, because maybe a cluster might also have a different pathway. We've talked about kind of biology. Maybe there's different biology also for different clusters, which people haven't looked at. And so Lauren led this process, and we took data from the TAN checklist, the things that you fill in, that families or doctors and families fill in, and we then used exactly the stuff that Marie-Claire talked about. data-driven methods to see, can we find clusters? And first she did a little study. This is kind of what it looks like when you heard that word, hierarchical cluster analysis. And then we did a slightly bigger study using Tosca, the study, not the person. And then we did the biggest study of almost 500 people. And that then confirmed and showed that there's a natural grouping, 7 natural groupings of TAND manifestations in people with TSC, all over the world, wherever they are, different ranges of ability. And that's the picture that Anne showed you. So our principle is we now want to use this to make it easier to access next steps. So it's a way to simplify life for people with TSC and for doctors who work with TSC and for therapists to help families with TSC. And so we went back to TSCI and said to them, okay, we've done this cluster stuff. What do you think? And they said, well, we like the clusters, but we are still struggling. In many places in the world, doctors and clinical teams still don't do the TAN checklist. So they said, can you make one that we can fill in ourselves at home? And if you make one that we can use, can you build it into an app that we can have at home? And then, can you make it in such a way that once we filled it in and we click on it, it will show our clusters, and then you will give us a toolkit of what we can do if we see problems in these clusters. So that's what you and the TSCI community said to us. And we said, well, it's an ambitious job, but we'd like to try. And that is the kind of heart of the Tandem project. So just to show you, and I'm going to go quickly because I want to make sure Tosca has time, the first aim of this project is therefore to make a self-complete version of the checklist, to build it, well, to give it numbers as well, so you can see how bad is it a problem or how little is it a problem, then to build it into the app, and then to make sure we check it against expert data. The second aim of the project is, you've already heard Anne talk about, we had to search the literature, and Stephanie will give you a summary of what we found in the next presentation. Anne has already given you the key consensus, the recommendations, and then the next step for us is now we are busy making the toolkit from those information to build into the app. And then the third main aim of the project is for us to build a network. We were very aware that there are not many people in the world who do research on TAND. And we need to make sure there's a next generation of people who will want to do research on TAND. And so one of our jobs is therefore to make sure that we train people, we find more people. And in fact, all of you are therefore in the TAND consortium. You just don't know it, because this is not a project for a small team. This is a project for more and more people. And we want more and more people to do this kind of work. So we have a nice structure, steering groups, cluster groups, all sorts of groups. And the most important group is we have in the study family representatives from many different countries. We have people who live with TSC or have family members with TSC, and they are in every group so that we can make sure we keep checking, are we going in the right direction? And Eva is one of the people in the group, and Eva always reminds us of the real life with TSC and that we should do things that are important for people with TSC. So that's the check for us to keep making sure we do meaningful things. And so we've now developed a TAND SQ, so we have it. It's going to look a little bit like this. We will soon share it with all of you. So it asks questions, it gives you numbers, and you can write things in. And Tosca, I will soon hand over to her, will show you what the current version of the app looks like. So she will talk you through all the different information that we can collect at the moment. Then the second part, you've already heard Anne talk about the consensus and the guidelines or the recommendations that we're writing. And we will write them as a paper for professionals and doctors, but we will also write them so that they can be used by anybody and everybody, particularly by families. You've seen how we've put it all together, and you've heard that we have people all over the world in 10 different countries, because we want to make sure that we're developing something. We're starting in English, but once we've done it, we then want to make sure it can be translated into many different languages. So before anyone says, can you do it in Dutch or French, we want to. But that will be the next step from this project. And we have many, many people participating, and we want more and more people to participate. And maybe we're halfway through the project now, maybe there's even a nice opportunity for us to think with STSN how you want to join the project towards the next step, maybe around the languages or maybe around particular things, but we would love to talk to people about that. So this is the point. I'm going to hand over to Tosca. She's going to be a voice from the back, and she will talk, and I will point. That was the best way to have the computer at the back. And what she's going to try to do now is to show you live what the app currently looks like, and just to give you an idea and a feel of what we're trying to do. So Tosca, I hope you are getting ready. Do I need to click through, or can you switch from your side? I get a thumbs up. There we go. Let's have a look.
Thanks.
So just tell me when you want me to point to anything, Tosca.
I will. Can everyone hear me? Cool. Sorry I'm here at the back, but I need to physically be linked by cable to the laptop to be able to do the demo. So today I'm going to present to you the current version of the app that we have right now, called the TAND Toolkit app. And it's still under development, but I'd like to show you what we have so far. So for this app, you'll be able to add members to your TSC family. So if you're caring for someone with TSC, or if you yourself, as an individual with TSC, you can add yourself to your TSC family. So yeah, I've just set up a profile already just for the demonstration. But when you add new members, they'll ask you certain questions just to add the member. And once you've added members to your TSC family, one of the first steps will be to capture a TSC story. So the TSC story, I'll show you one here, is going to ask you some questions about, in this case, I've created a demo version for someone I care about. So I've said, that, for instance, my child has a TSC diagnosis. And this TSC story is going to ask you questions about your child's diagnosis. So, for instance, it'll ask, at what age was she diagnosed? I'm really just filling in any random data here. It's going to ask you about what were the first concerns that led to the diagnosis. It's going to ask you questions about the diagnostic criteria of TSC. These names will be a little bit difficult for me to pronounce, so forgive me. Once you've captured that, you move on to the next question, asking how would you rate the overall severity of the physical TSC manifestations. It'll ask about the severity, how much has these troubled or distressed you and your family. It'll ask if you've done genetic testing for TSC. It'll ask which gene is affected. And then it'll also ask a few more questions about epilepsy. When did the epilepsy start? Have the seizures stopped, etc. It'll ask you to describe the severity of the seizures and how these have affected your family. And then it'll also ask you about treatment with mTOR inhibitors. You'll see there's a bunch of questions there. So those are, right now, that's what they capture within the TSC story. You'll then be able to view your results. You can also download these. And this is a summary that you can have for yourself, or that you can ultimately share with your doctor or clinician one day, capturing all the information that you've now put down in the TSC story. Once you've captured that, you can move on to the TAND checklist. So this TAN checklist is now containing it's the quantified self-report version. So the checklist that families themselves and caregivers can fill out on their own. There's a question that will update regularly asking the school status. And then you can get going. So question 1 is about milestones. For example, first smiled, sat without support. It's going to ask you a whole lot of those milestone questions. It's going to ask the current level of language, self-care, mobility. And then it's going to move on to the behaviors, and it's going to quantify these. So for instance, has anxiety ever been a problem? Then it's allowing you to quantify between 0, not at all, and extremely. Asks about depressed mood, mood swings, aggressive outbursts, temper tantrums, self-injury, absence or delayed onset of language, repeating words or phrases, eye contact, getting on with people of similar age, repetitive behaviors, rigid or inflexible behavior, sensory sensitivities, overactivity, hyperactivity, paying attention, has that ever been a problem, restlessness or fidgetiness, impulsivity, eating or drinking problems, sleep. And then it also asks you, have any other behaviors ever been a concern? So here, the app allows you the freedom to add other behaviors that we might not have already listed here. I'm just going to create a default there.
And this is a way that we can learn about new things that you might know about that we don't yet know about. So it's a new data that we can learn from.
And then, the app will show you which items you've listed as yes, which you've marked have been a problem. And it'll ask if you've had further evaluation or support for these difficulties and if you would like further evaluation or support. Oh, and now you'll see I missed one of the questions because it's not letting me go to the next one yet. Let me just check which one I missed. There we go. Forgot to quantify. Now the next button is available, so now I can proceed to the next question. Question 4 asks about specific psychiatric diagnoses. And over here you can also add other psychiatric disorders. And it also asks you if you've had support for these or if you would like to receive support. Question 5 asks about the intellectual ability of the child. Question 6 relates to school. So for example, reading, writing, spelling, mathematics. And also over here you have the opportunity to add additional learning difficulties at this question. Question 7 focuses on specific brain skills. So the individual items that you can quantify are motor skills, language skills, attention, concentration problems, dual tasking, multitasking, memory, visual spatial tasks, executive skills, being disoriented, processing speed, and it also gives you the opportunity to capture additional brain skills that might not have been mentioned here. And you can also quantify that. Question 8 is asking about the psychosocial difficulties. So specifically question 8.1 is about the individual with TSC. So for example, about self-esteem, stress in the family, stress in relationship with siblings, parent-child relationship difficulties, parent-to-parent or partner relationship difficulties, stress leading for the family to communicate with others in their community, and also with you as a caregiver to progress in your career. Question 2 asks similar items, but these are about the caregiver.
And we deliberately wanted to add a section not just asking about the person with TSC, but also about the caregivers, given the importance of caring for the caregiver.
Then question 9 says, taking together all the difficulties, how much of these bother, troubled, or stressed you as your family over the last month? And question 10 lists all the items for the behaviors and the scholastic difficulties and the brain skills. The items that you quantified as yes, and it asks you to prioritize which would be your top 3 priorities to work on next. And then it also asks for additional information if there's anything that was not covered in the TAN checklist that you would like to add. Once you've done that, you'll also go to a screen where you can view a summary. You can also download the summary of the quantified version of the TAN checklist called the TAN SQ. This is again a useful resource that you can be able to share with your clinician. And then you can also view the TAN cluster profile. So this was obviously just generated on dummy data that I've entered over here. But this will be able to give you an idea of the 8 different clusters and the percentage that cluster is affected. So ultimately, once we've built the toolkit in, we would like to be able to show you this cluster summary and then to be able to give you to be able to build the TAN toolkit in so that for each of these clusters you can view sort of what to seek and what to do information in the toolkit. So what to seek by professionals, for instance, and what to do self-help, things that you can try at home to support your child. And we've also got a survey functionality that we might want to ask you to fill out some surveys to get some additional information to help us learn a bit more about TAN. And yeah, that's where the app is
and the
so far.
survey function is also a tool that, let's say, Eleonora has a specific question about a particular behavior or something, then we can create a short little survey to put into the app that we can then ask people who are using the app. And it can give us a little bit of data that maybe it might then be helpful for us to understand something, or to have a little preliminary data for a study, or to understand, does this treatment work or that drug or what. So it gives us another way to learn from people in the community, not just to tell people in the community.
Yeah, that's all for
And
me.
Tosca gives us a thumbs up, so I think with that, I'm conscious of the time. I think this might be a good time for me and Tosca to pause and hand you over to Stephanie, or hand you back to the chair who will introduce Stephanie. But I hope that's given you a feeling of what we're trying to do. And we're very keen to hear from you what you think, what your ideas, what your thoughts are around the Tandem project and the app development. So with that, I shall hand back to the chair. Thank you.